What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Eclectic Beard. So this go around, we're going to take a look at a video from the channel, the Armchair Historian. There's so many good history channels on YouTube. It's not even funny. Um, I try to always make sure that their stuff plays through, whether it's intro. Now, the stuff for like the ads and stuff like that. That stuff I do try to cut out, but I do at least try to make sure that the stuff plays through of what channel they are, so that way people can look at it. That's the reason why I always take and put links, which I do that anyways. But just there's so many different good history channels. Now you got ones like the Infographic Show, which it's not the best channel to get information from, but at least gives you a starting point. Those channels serve a purpose as well, for the most part. This right here, though, from a channel that's got some really good insights on different aspects of history. This one, How Did Britain Conquer India? We're going to take a look at. Let's go ahead and get started.
This video was made possible by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, online store, or website, make it with Squarespace. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's episode, how the British Empire was able to assert control over India.
Prime and low. Fire.
Love the animation there.
The Indian subcontinent was subjugated by an island more than 20 times smaller in size. This unimaginable conquest of what would become the jewel in the British crown greatly empowered the British Empire. By the middle of the 19th century, British rule led to a new wave of South Asian nationalist movements, the effects to which are still felt to this day. But we're not going to be delving into too much detail about the consequences of British rule. Rather, our goal is to evaluate what actions taken by the British and Indians alike paved the way for British rule in the first place. In order to understand how the British were able to take control of India, we need to go back to New Year's Eve on 1600, well into the reign of Elizabeth I. It was her signature on a royal charter granted to a group of adventure merchants, later known as the East India Company, that would change the destinies of two nations forever. However, at the time, the company's
Adventure merchants. I think that's putting it highly lightly, but it's amazing the influence those adventure merchants, how much influence they wound up having, how much influence their company had, because they had some power.
Change the destinies of two nations forever. However, at the time, the company's leaders were not yet interested in trading directly with the reigning Indian power of the time. Instead, they focused on competing with the Dutch, French, and Portuguese in the East Indies. But over time, the East India Company, after being driven out of the East Indies, shifted its focus onto the Indian subcontinent. In 1640, a company representative succeeded in securing a grant of land in southern India, a pivotal moment, as it marked the first time that Indian land was owned directly by the English.
They learned the hard way. You don't give white people land. Doesn't end up good.
It was on this land that they constructed Fort St. George.
And by the way, that's a joke, so anybody in the comments, just piss off.
The settlement that grew around this region became the thriving city of Madras, now known as Chennai, and home to over 7 million people. As more and more company-owned forts and settlements sprang up all over the Indian subcontinent, the English became a leading exporter of spices, which, in the words of Brian Gardner, author of the East India Company, had a considerable place in life. Men were prepared to die in search of them, and many did. No gift was more acceptable, and to be well supplied was a mark of status. Wealth could be measured in spices.
I mean, you take a look at the fact, like Marco Polo, traveling the Silk Road, spices were currency. They made many men across the annals of time just absolutely wealthy and rich. If you controlled spices, you were top dog, dude, like for real. So I mean, the fact that that's how, number one, securing land in the first place. I joke, they found out the hard way you can't give white people land, maybe, but it's kind of self-evident here, taking and showing, 5 different. If we see that right there, beginning of their downfall, pretty much, just allowing them to take and get a foothold like that. At least as far as national identity is concerned. So let's get a don't get anything twisted. I'm not bashing on. I'm just taking and stating generalized shit here. So whatever. Think what you want. Piss on it.
The French, Danish, and Dutch all became similarly active in Indian affairs from the 17th century onwards, with the Portuguese already established in the region. Joining me now is our good friend History with Hilbert, who will be providing us with some background information on the Mughal Empire.
As the 18th century commenced, the Europeans became increasingly involved in Indian affairs. They could afford to, because the Mughal Empire, which once ruled over not just the majority of India, but also parts of modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, was on the decline in the wake of very costly wars of conquest. The Mughals suffered from repeated invasions by Persians, Afghans, and other Indians. In 1739, the Mughal capital, Delhi, was sacked by the Persian ruler Nader Shah, following the decisive Battle of Kurnool, and in 1748, Nader Shah's protege, the Afghan Ahmed Shah Durrani, also led his armies into Mughal territory, beginning his own invasion. Due to these factors, by the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal emperor took the role of a figurehead to many new empowered local rulers. If you'd like to check out my video that goes into more detail about the Mughals, then follow the link in the description below.
Thanks for joining us again, Hilbert.
Just real quick before it gets too much further, and I know I've paused it quite a few times, but that's kind of what I do. I find it interesting, like, they've already got these bases and stuff like that. You get that kind of fracturing within a place. Like, it had probably been harder for them to take, for the East India Company to get as big as they did within India itself, with the influence they wind up having, if you'd have had a more stout rule by one overall empire. You've got all this infighting, the overextension of the country and stuff like that. So you got all this fracturing. It's a lot easier to eventually down the road, once your influence gathers so much, to really just take control of somewhere, even if you're just a corporation. It's amazing to me, because the overall size of India itself, but you see Great Britain, France, Netherlands, Portugal. I mean, it's a lot of hands in a single pot. It really is.
As the Mughals weakened, the Maratha kingdom in the central west of India was carving out an empire of its own. Despite never eclipsing the Mughal Empire at its height, the Maratha Empire remained as a dominant power in India for another 80 years or so. As all of this was happening, the East India Company began to overshadow its European competitors, devoting substantial profits to raising a private army in an effort to contend with the Maratha Empire and Bengal. By now,
See, that's when a company's got wealth. They can raise their own private armies. Like, that's insane. But again, that's going to serve a purpose in a place like this, to where you've got so many different competing interests and so many different so many different powers, forming and stuff like that. You got fracturing like that. It's easier to take and become more dominant, because you got, like I said, divided interest.
East India Company benefited greatly from the country's imposing navy, which enabled it to ferry more and more men to India than its European competitors. As much as the company's military aided in its growth, it was the laissez-faire policy that won over many local rulers to their side, many of whom benefited financially from their dealings with the company and did not perceive their sovereignty to be at risk.
And that's the other thing, the money aspect. And again, like I said, the national identity, like, I'm not trying to take and bash Great Britain, UK, I'm not trying to bash anything that happened. It's just a reality. And their national identity, like the people that live with them. So their leaders were getting rich, and they're basically selling them downstream for those riches. Because you got to wonder, Here in the U.S. we hear all the time, trickle down economics. The big wigs make all the money and blah 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 blah. You got to wonder if maybe that wasn't seen as a good thing by locals until things shifted and changed.
Of all the Europeans who had established themselves in India, the British and French based in the south were now preeminent. But under the daring Robert Clive, the British East India Company's army was able to defeat both the Bengalese and their French allies at the Battle of Plassey during the 7 Years' War, which, by the 1760s, allowed them to assert control over much of the Indian subcontinent unchecked through direct territorial possession or indirect tributary arrangements.
I'm going to say this now, circa 1760, you got the French and Indian Wars that were going on around the same times. They're fighting the French over there. You got the 7 Years' War. Shortly after, you got the American War for Independence. They were still having issues with France. Like, this gives a more fuller picture outside of the subject matter within this, because it kind of translates back to my own country's history, because things like this are the reason why they couldn't give their full attention to the U.S. colonies. If they could, we'd probably still be British subjects, or at least part of the Commonwealth.
To quote Gardner once more, by the Treaty of Paris 1763, the French forts taken by the company were returned to them, some of them having been razed to the ground. But the French never recovered, and only 6 years later, the French East India Company collapsed, although the stations remained in the possession of France. During the British advance into the Indian heartland, it encountered staunch resistance from the Sikh Empire and other Indian states not interested in doing business with the English. The Duke of Wellington, who would later go on to defeat Napoleon, won several victories against these states while aiding his brother Richard Wellesley, who acted as Governor General of India. Consequently, by the turn of the 19th century, the Wellesley brothers had succeeded in leaving behind them the foundations of an empire greater even that of Akbar himself.
Admiral, we have enemy ships in Sector 47. It's a trap.
As the middle of the 19th century drew closer, an Indian national consciousness began to take form, as company rule resulted in a wider array of social and economic reforms being demanded from increasingly alienated local rulers. These sentiments culminated in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, which was brutally suppressed and concluded with the formal dissolution of the Mughal Empire and the transfer of power from the British East India Company to Britain itself. Power now rested in the hands of the British Crown directly, and as the 19th century continued, India's resources and the livelihoods of its people were exploited to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Britain, leading to a series of famines which shook the Indian economy to the core and left millions of Indians dead.
It is insane to me how a company gets big enough that they can basically, I would say aid, but probably be the main contributing factor to the overthrow of overtaking a country before handing it over to the government of the country you're in. So holy shit. It's insane. To me, that's crazy. To me, that is absolutely insane that they'd have that much power. They get that foothold, and then everything just kind of follows after. And now we're taking and seeing one of the unfortunates of what happens a lot of times during conquest or after a conquest happens. And granted that, I'm sure some of the reforms might have been for the better, but it looks like a lot of it caused some heartache.
One thing was certain, the British Empire now had millions of new subjects under its rule in India, and imperial expansion wouldn't stop there. To conclude, the political vacuum left by the Mughal Empire in the wake of repeated invasions, the failure of other Indian states, particularly the Maratha Empire, to fill that vacuum and unify India, the failure of other European powers to stop the British, Britain's military and industrial superiority, and the governing policy of the East India Company allowed Britain to take over the Indian subcontinent.
Just looking at all that red area, which would be, I'm guessing, their colonies or their, the places they held control in. They could have done anything they wanted. I mean, it seems like the British could do anything they wanted. It really does. And for it to be coming from, this big of an area right here as compared to, like you said, India's 12 times larger. But you're taking a look at Bangladesh and Pakistan, or not Bangladesh, but Pakistan, Kazakhstan, all the way down into here into, parts of, looks like would be maybe Laos and you got Vietnam, I think Laos, Cambodia, down here into the Indonesian and Malaysian, Papua New Guinea. I mean, it's one of those things. It's crazy. It is entirely crazy. You got large portions of the African continent. Just they could do whatever they wanted. Like you take a look at the fact that at the time of the 1700s, they're fighting. You got 7 Years' War, you got the French and Indian War, and it's spilling over into the Indian, subcontinent. The only reason why the U.S. won its freedom is for the simple fact of the matter they couldn't put all the resources towards putting the rebellion down. I mean, literally, that's the way it looks, for sure.
Now back to our sponsor. Recently, Squarespace has made my life a lot easier. This website building platform offers a wide array of custom. I'd like to thank the Armchair Historian team and my general staff on Patreon.
All right, so there we have it. How did Britain conquer India? It's just, to me, it's just flabbergasting. Taking and seeing, they do a real good. This channel does a real good job, and it's not even taking and digging that deep into the specifics of everything. It's covering first and second base basically of how this happened. They did a real good job taking with the visualization, the animation of taking and showing the places, how they got the forts and stuff like that. It's just, for a company to get that big, I would say it's kind of mind blowing. But we look at modern day companies and corporations, and they're global corporations, and the influence they have. The fact that you had the same type thing going on hundreds of years beforehand, to me, is really the thing that's just mind blowing. This was crazy. Just, my goodness, just a might of not only the British but also the British East India Company. Just absolutely, and it's stunning, especially the visualization, and you hear about how it's happened and everything, how it happened and everything. It's just stunning, because for a company to get big enough to raise its own private army and then take and push through and give a whole country, like a massive size country, to the crown, that's a feat. Like that's an accomplishment. It really is. So, good or bad, I'll leave that up to you. But that's an accomplishment. Y'all be good to each other. Love yourselves. Peace.